the glory. Sing worthy of it all.
Why does a good God allow evil to?
So that first of all, we get asked that a lot, right? And maybe in today's day and age, understandably, probably the best question and the best refute about God. But I'm going to show you that, in fact, the problem of evil actually is a way to argue back to God. Okay, what we're really talking about when you're talking about evil, you're talking about morality, right? And um, when you talk about morality, there's a couple things you have to talk about. You have to talk about, do objective moral values exist? In other words, are there standards of good and evil? Because if there aren't, then you're really talking about nothing. If there's not objective moral good and evil, right and wrong, then who cares? It just doesn't matter. If it truly all is subjective, then you can't call something evil and you can't call something good. So by the fact that an atheist or someone asks you about the problem of evil, they're at least acknowledging that evil exists and that is there is some sort of objective standard. And if you're asking the question, do objective moral evils exist? I would say absolutely. This is a pictograph of Moloch, which was the metallic idol of the Canaanites, upon which they would heat him up with fire to the point to where he was red hot, and they would sacrifice their infant children to the god Moloch. And the screams, it is said, were so loud that they had a band playing there, and the band would play louder and louder and louder as these children would sizzle and cry until they died, so that their parents actually couldn't hear their screams. And I think the bottom line is killing children or torturing children for fun is objectively morally evil or wrong. And I think almost anything that we consider bad, if you add "for fun" at the end of it, that kind of seals it, right? If you torture children for fun, if you kill children for fun, that is an objectively morally evil thing. The Holocaust it wouldn't matter. If the Nazis had won, it would still have been objectively morally evil, even though they didn't think so, for them to have exterminated the Jews. Racism, that's obviously a very hot and common topic today. Racism itself is never justified. It is a morally reprehensible thing, right? Being killed for the sake of your religion. So even if ISIS is a picture of ISIS beheading a Christian, even if ISIS conquered the world, it would still be objectively wrong for them to kill people in the name of Allah. So do objective moral duties exist? So duties are obligations, right? And I would argue that there are objective obligations, things we ought to do. We ought to be brave instead of cowardly in the face of defending our families or defending our country if we're called upon to do that. We are morally bound to take care of our elderly and our infirmed and our handicapped, right? We are morally bound to fight against sex trafficking, which is a way bigger problem than what people think. We are morally bound. We are obliged to do these things. So I would say that both moral standards of evil and good exist, and moral obligations, objective moral obligations exist. So when you talk about evil, you gotta think about, what are you actually talking about? Well, you're gauging one thing versus the other. In order to gauge one thing versus the other, you have to have some sort of standard. We wouldn't know what an inch was if we didn't have a ruler, a tape measure, right? You wouldn't be able to tell me what is good or evil. You wouldn't be able to say what's evil, rather, unless you know what's good. You have to have a measuring tape to say what is evil. So by an atheist asking you, why does so much evil exist? They are acknowledging the existence of good. And what is the standard of good? Well, first of all, evil is the opposite of good. Okay, so that's the first, is the absence of good, or it's the antithesis of good. And there are actually two types of evil. Now, what most people are talking about most of the time is moral evil, not natural evil. Moral evil comes about because of two things. We as Christians believe that God put Adam and Eve on earth initially sinless. But when they chose to disobey God and eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, we as a people, as a whole, as the human race, fell into a sin nature. And the reason that we were able to do this is God gave us free will. And some would say, well, why would God give us free will if he knew that we were then going to do evil? Well, the easy answer to that, and I believe the correct answer to that, is he gave us free will because if he didn't, then it wouldn't truly have been love. We could never have truly chosen to love God if we didn't have free will. If we were just automatons, we wouldn't really love God. We would just be doing what we were told. He gave us free will, and unfortunately, Adam and Eve fell from grace by committing sin and put us into a fallen world. The evil, the moral evil that now exists in the world is a consequence of our free will and the fallen world. But I think the best thing that I could say here is, and when you're talking about how do you flip that question and say, well, you asking me the question about how much evil there is actually a path back to God. My favorite apologist in the world is Ravi Zacharias, who unfortunately passed away recently and went home to be with God. He said, when you say there's too much evil in this world, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver. And I'll add in there, because all laws have a lawgiver or a lawmaker. But that's who you're trying to disprove and not to prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. So what is your question? And I think that's the best way to put it. If you're asking me as an atheist, why is there so much evil in this world? First of all, it's because God gave us free will and we're sinful people. But if you posit that there's evil, you got to posit that there's good, from which you know the standard of evil. And the standard of good is God. So I think that's the best way to explain that. So I kind of threw a lot of things out there, so you may have some other questions about that, do you?
Well, the reason I asked this question was because this question was posed to me by not an atheist, but actually an unsure Catholic friend.
Okay.
Um, I was talking to him about God and everything,
Mm-hmm.
and he said he believes like a 50-50, like 50 because of like things that happened to him,
Okay.
that's why he believed in God, and 50 because he was unsure because of the problem evil,
Mm-hmm.
and he used the virus for an example.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been meaning to get back to him on that, but I didn't want to first come back to him as unsure of my answer, and two, I needed to find a proper time to where I can re-ask him this question.
Now, the answer to his question may be a little bit different. So, what we just went through is an explanation of evil, right? Of why evil exists and how, in fact, it can go back to God. When you're talking to your friend, in reality, one of the things you may end up finding yourself doing is actually explaining why God allows evil. And that's actually what they call a theodicy. So a theodicy is a little bit different. But in a theodicy, you actually try to you attempt to explain why God does it, why God allows evil. And I would say a couple things. First of all, the Bible actually teaches us that we will go through suffering. Okay? And that part of that suffering does a couple things. Number one, Jesus suffered. And in some ways, our human suffering um, can help to shape us to be more like Christ in and of itself. The second thing is when a non-believer or even another believer sees a firm believer in God suffering and yet holding tight to their faith in God throughout that suffering, that actually helps to boost our own faith. And I'll give you a personal example. My sister, who is a Christian, is 2 years younger than me. A few years back, she had breast cancer. And I saw her, throughout her breast cancer, truly live by the verse Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What Paul was talking about there was having joy despite hardships. And my sister truly showed me joy in the Lord throughout a year of surgery after surgery and chemo and radiation. So sometimes God may allow suffering in a believer's life in order to strengthen other believers' faith. The third thing is, it can strengthen your own faith. So if you are a believer and you start to undergo what you consider evil or hardship or suffering, that can, if you lean on God, sometimes, and looking back in my life, I will say that sometimes when I look back, the times I was actually closest to God were times when I was going through the most amount of hardship and suffering in my life, what many people might call evil. So those are different theodicies that can explain why God might inflict evil upon someone else. You see this best in the book of Job, right? And you see it in that in God actually sovereignly allowing Job to suffer at the hands of Satan, to show Satan and to show Job's friends that if he believed in him throughout, that it would ultimately show God's glory, and it did. So that would be probably a better way for you to come back to your friend and say, listen, this is some of the reasons God may actually be allowing some of this evil and suffering. Another part of that theodicy is to say, if, say, an infant dies, we would consider that at the hands of a murderer, right? We would consider that a tragic thing. We would consider that evil. But we have no way of seeing what God sees, right? We see time in a linear fashion. God sees time in an umbrella fashion. He can see it all at once. And for all we know, if that infant hadn't died at the hands of that murderer, any number of things could have happened. That infant could have undergone more and more and more suffering throughout its life. And in fact, that death could have perhaps actually been less suffering than it would have had at other times in its life, number one. Number two, for all we know, that infant that died could have been 10 times worse than Hitler or Stalin or Mao. We have no way of knowing that. We don't have the perspective that God has. So what to us may look like evil, to God may in fact be the least of all evils. Does that make sense? We hope that you enjoyed the content of our video today. If you did, make sure to give us a thumbs up and share this content. Also, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so that you are alerted to any new content that we post on our channel. Please remember that all of our video content is completely free of charge and can be reposted, shared, and embedded. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Armor of God Apologetics with an S. Thank you for watching and have a blessed day.
For from you are all things, and to you are all things.